Oggetti Socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
I'm a sociologist based at the University of Tasmania in Australia, but actually I immigrated to Australia in 2002 with my family. And my area of expertise is mainly housing, but I also co-author with a philosopher called Jeff Malpas. Really, my conversations and readings with him really form the basis for this particular paper, which you yourself read. I was interested really in the issue of kind of home objects, just because of my observations of, talking to everyone in everyday life. People are so keen to show you around their home, to talk about their objects, about how they see themselves in relation to their home. I was just aware from my research as a kind of housing sociologist how the home is such a fundamental component of one's identity. And of course, that's a very broad kind of description. So really, what do we mean by home? What actually constitutes the home? How do we see the home? How do we adore the home? How do we decorate it? Are all issues which I think kind of housing scholars should attend to. That they do now, but a lot of the most interesting work, as you know, is actually from anthropology. People like Daniel Miller on material cultures. So that formed the basis of my interest in that. I also read a lot of literature, and I was very struck probably a year before I wrote the article, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, which is a very, very thick description of people's homes, people's lives. And I thought Proust had some very, very interesting ideas about the way in which material objects generate effects, some of which we're aware of, some of which we're not. So the actual article you read draws on that particular novel as a way of advancing or developing some of the arguments at the start of the paper.
I think it's quite interesting the fact that even though you are within the housing studies, as a professor and also as a research, you started the article because of your personal experience of objects. Do you think the interest came up because of your studies, or you think the interest came up because of reading the novel, so it's completely separate?
All writing is autobiographical. I mean, I always feel that people, the academics whose research is history or architecture or politics, they're all drawing on their personal experiences. I know there's a claim to be objective, but everything we do is always about ourselves, either in opposition or according to ourselves. I mean, often we write about things we don't like as much as we like, but the biography of the self is always in some way implicated in one's writing. It's probably difficult to say what came first. I think when you move as a migrant, I mean, places of the past are no longer accessible. So some of the mementos, some of the objects we bring with us from our former country to a new country become very, very significant, because we're in a sense moving 11,000 miles away from London meant that all the kind of things in my house which we moved, we brought with us when we moved, became very, very significant as kind of, I suppose they were kind of repositories of memory. So I'd look at a picture or I'd look at a piece of furniture, and it would trigger off kind of memories about my life in London before we moved. So that was certainly of interest, and I was curious about, why these objects become so significant, why they ebb and flow. Sometimes we notice them, and other times we just ignore them, and how much we imbue meaning into these objects, and how these objects resonate feelings. I mean, I reread the article just before the interview, and one of the things we argued was that often we're just unconscious of how the material objects actually shape our experience. We tend to think we're in control, or we kind of access these pictures, these tables, these chairs, as if we are aware of their effects, but often we're just unaware of their effects, but they actually structure our experiences. So the way the furniture is arranged in a room, we're not really conscious how it actually changes conversations often, but they do. And when you're familiar with all this, of course, as being an architect, you're well aware that design can generate all sorts of effects which many people may not even anticipate.
I think this lockdown experience are also giving a possibility for people to understand a little bit better how this has an effect on their life, and what are they putting in their house has also an effect on them. So having more conscious decisions, for example, of what to throw away, what to keep, how to create space.
Yeah, look, I think in a way the objects become significant at a time of uncertainty or change. So moving from one country to the next generates uncertainties, anxieties. But so does COVID. The impossibility of maintaining normal social relationships because of lockdown meant that people were forced to kind of reflect internally at what they could control, which was their home environment. So one can see that, the anxiety we have at the moment about climate change, about political uncertainty, has generally led, I think, to a kind of inward-lookingness, reflecting on things we can control, because so many things are outside of our control, and that in a way the issues of the home and our relationships with the objects of the home are something we feel we have more control over. And I think in a way the external world, the world of global politics, we feel disempowered at the moment. So I think it's all quite interesting. There's been such an interest in material culture. I mean, I think it does, in a sense, suggest to me that it's a symptomatic of the kind of political crisis, which is so apparent to all of us at the moment.
I was particularly interested in your paper, which is the fact that you were calling for new research to putting together this idea that dwelling is something that we can define or we can fully control as architects, for example, and putting this idea within the housing studies of today's, which are more, you say, utilitarian, prudent, and even commercial. And this paper was from 2013. Do you think this has happened?
I certainly think that housing is a much larger field over the last 10, 15 years than it was when I started studying housing issues 30 years ago. Things have become more multidisciplinary. I think there's more understanding of the way in which housing is so fundamental to all our lives and experience. The argument in the paper is that the self isn't formed in somehow a separate intersubjective kind of way. Our self is only constituted through our engagement with the material world. There is no kind of hidden self which somehow is there regardless of the outside world. It's only through our relationships with each other and the material world that actually creates the notion of self. We can't have a self without that relationality, without those relations. And that was the key argument, and that's why the title of the paper, a Relational Housing Research Agenda. We wanted to look at that, what we thought was a fundamental truth, that our notion of identity can only be formed in relation to other objects, other people, to the material world. And what most housing researchers were looking at the time, which was just the symbolic components of the home. They thought that the home was either interesting for two reasons. One, because it had a symbolic kind of resonance for people, that it symbolized something about their lives, and also what it represented for them, where we're saying actually it's much more, it actually is identity. They're inseparable.
When I read this part of the article, I was quite struck because I think the idea of self-development and self-formation is something that we don't really understand in relation to home. I was really thinking about also your other article of the possibility to actually have a home or rent a house and have good pricing, because it's also something that you do to have a self-development and self-formation for everyone.
But that's very important. I mean, I've been arguing for years and years that actually if we want to create a society where people are at ease with each other, we have to find ways in which people feel at ease with where they live. If we're serious about a society which is one where we feel happy with, then we have to create the conditions where people can flourish. And I think the big mistake housing academics and sociologists and even political economists make is they see the housing system in terms of a crisis, as if everything is falling apart and people can't buy their home. I don't think it's a crisis at all. I think the system operates successfully for very wealthy people to make money. It's actually established by wealthy elites and banks and developers and real estate agencies to make money, and shortage is a fundamental necessity to create wealth. I think the housing problem is a very simple one. It's an issue of greed, actually.
So we establish all of these relations between home and objects and how also the home is a place of self-identity. Do you think COVID will change the way the home will be? Do you think people will change their priority with home and objects?
It's really, really interesting question. I would say it's impossible to know because we're right in the middle of the pandemic. I would just say to you, it's probably too early to tell. There was a famous Chinese politician, I think in the 1960s, his name I forget, but he was asked about the impact of the French Revolution. And he said it's too early to tell. It's impossible to really have any clear conclusions about the impact of COVID because we're right in the middle of it. But saying that, it's clear that it has fundamentally changed the way people think about their lives. You can see that the way people are now questioning work, and the kind of career trajectories which some young people feel about. It's changed the way we feel about the home, which we've discussed, and our social relationships. I mean, I find, for me personally, the COVID pandemic, and it's been much, much less severe in Tasmania, where I live, than it has been anywhere in Europe, made me realise how important people are to me. I always thought that actually, I can survive by reading, listening, going on walks, but actually, when all those possibilities were somehow made less easy, I just really realised how much I miss, family, my children in Melbourne. All these things I took for granted were no longer possible. And it really made me appreciate more than anything else that actually people really matter. We might all think that we're independent people who can go about our lives regardless of who we know, but actually it's not true. We're all dependent on those social relationships. So that's what I've learned.
So how were you utilising your living space at home, and how this has changed your lockdown experience?
My children have left home. They're both kind of grown up. So because Teresa had to work at home and I had to work, Teresa created an office downstairs in one of our children's bedrooms. And I kind of worked from my office where I'm talking to you now. We did a few things around the house, like kind of minor decorations, and we bought some new blinds for the living room. I mean, we started to notice things a bit more. But we were not impacted in the same way you were in the Netherlands, in the sense that apart from a few months of lockdown, everything went back to normal except travel.
What type of value do you personally give to object, and how this has changed during the lockdown experience?
I really value the objects I have in my house. I have lots of pictures, and they're not pictures which are expensive. They're often prints. And I look at them and they give me enormous pleasure. I have lots of books, and I look at those books and they mean so much to me. Even though I've read them, I put them there and I look at them and I go back and forth. And it's the same with furniture, carpets, photographs. I mean, everything to me is of value here, and I love looking at them and talking about them, and they're so evocative for me. It's like reading a novel sometimes. They set off a whole set of memories for me. We decorated at one of the library, and all the books had to be piled up into boxes while we decorated. And I felt like my whole identity was kind of fragmented, and I only felt better when all the books were back on the shelf. It was a very strange experience, so they're enormously important to me.
What does sociable objects means to you, or what does make you think the word of sociable objects?
Most people, if you ask them what an object is, they would say it's something which has no life, that it's something separate from us, that objects are not that significant because they're just mementos or things we can buy and throw away. But what your conception of objects is a very rich one, which is the one I would endorse and one I share, which is that objects, we can't really see objects in that way. Objects are so fundamental to who we are and how we live and how we relate that actually they are sociable. And once you understand that conception of objects, it opens up a whole world of being, that actually we can appreciate things which we took for granted. It creates new vocabularies about how we think about ourselves, about how we think about our environment. So what I think your project does so successfully, it brings home a fundamental truth about our lives, which is actually what we encounter, both as humans and non-humans. The material actually is fundamental to the way we make our lives a good life. I think it enriches our understanding of how we live successfully. If we can recognize objects in that way, it creates better conditions for living. It just expands our imagination and creates new possibilities of thinking and connecting.